They say the higher you rise, the lonelier the sky becomes. Serena Carter pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she stepped into the first-class cabin, her breath still carrying the sting of 1,000 silent battles no one else could see. The soft hum of the plane, the subtle scent of leather seats, the distant clinking of glasses, all of it blurred into a quiet echo inside her mind. She had spent her entire life building empires, rewriting the rules of boardrooms and turning her scars into shields. Yet here, above the clouds, she only wanted one simple thing: to be treated like a human being. Serena settled into her window seat, her fingers brushing the edge of a small leather-bound journal she always carried. She closed her eyes, hoping for a few hours of peace away from meetings, deals, and the heavy crown of expectations. A sharp voice cut through the gentle air. "Excuse me, ma'am, I believe you're in the wrong cabin." Serena opened her eyes slowly, locking onto the cold, narrowed gaze of Julia Bennett, the flight attendant. She stayed still, feeling the familiar chill crawl up her spine, that old, ugly question echoing in her head. "How many times must I prove I belong?" "This is my seat," she answered softly, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of countless unspoken wars. Julia's lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. She leaned forward, scanning Serena's modest gray coat and understated handbag, as if searching for a flaw she could exploit. "I'll need to see your ticket," Julia demanded. Without a word, Serena reached into her bag and handed over the ticket, her hand trembling just enough for only her to notice. The silence in the cabin grew thick, passengers shifting in their seats, watching but pretending not to. Julia examined the ticket longer than necessary, flipping it over, searching for an error that did not exist. The longer she looked, the more Serena felt her dignity stripped away piece by piece, like flesh peeled by a cold blade. Finally, Julia returned the ticket, her voice laced with poison. "Maybe you're mistaken, you don't seem suited for this seat." A slow fire burned behind Serena's eyes. She straightened her back, every inch of her spine screaming for her to stand, to shout, to remind the world of who she was. But she didn't. She smiled, a quiet, unbreakable smile. "I am exactly where I belong." The air vibrated, heavy with an unspoken storm. Somewhere deep inside, Serena felt the first crack of thunder, signaling a war she was more than ready to fight. Serena Carter had always believed the sky held secrets. As she stepped onto Flight 417 bound for San Francisco, she felt the weight of the world loosen, just for a moment. Her dark eyes scanned the cabin, the polished wood paneling and soft lighting whispering promises of calm she desperately needed. She wore a simple gray coat, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. No diamonds, no designer logos. Just her and a quiet strength that had carried her through countless battles in boardrooms and beyond. A businessman in a navy suit glanced up as she walked past, his eyes pausing, unsure whether to nod or look away. Serena offered a gentle, polite smile, the kind that could dissolve 1,000 unspoken judgments. She found her seat by the window, seat 2A, her sanctuary above the clouds. She exhaled slowly, allowing the distant hum of the engines to soften the noise in her mind. The journal in her bag pressed against her side, full of notes on her next charity initiative, plans to build education centers in forgotten corners of the country. Even here, she could never truly escape her mission. As she tucked her bag into the overhead compartment, a memory flickered: the small apartment she grew up in, the creaking floorboards, the smell of her mother's evening stew. She had climbed from there to this seat, one step at a time, each move defying every statistic ever written about women like her. Serena sank into her seat, fingers tracing the edge of the armrest. Outside, the runway stretched out under a fading sunset, gold melting into violet. For the first time all week, she let herself imagine floating free, weightless above the smallness of human prejudice. But peace was never meant to last. A sharp click of heels approached, each step a warning. Serena glanced up to see Julia Bennett, the flight attendant, standing over her. Julia's eyes narrowed, her lips curled slightly as if she had caught something sour in the air. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Serena felt a familiar sting rise in her chest. She kept her voice steady, every syllable a shield. Yes, seat 2A. Julia's gaze swept from Serena's face down to her modest clothes, back up again. I'll need to see your boarding pass, Julia insisted, her voice sharp enough to cut silk. Serena's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her bag. She handed over the pass without a word, her eyes fixed on Julia's expression, watching every micro-shift of muscle that betrayed a deeper disdain. Passengers nearby turned their heads, eyes flickering before darting away. The hush that fell over the cabin pressed against Serena's skin like ice. Julia examined the pass longer than necessary. The seconds dragged out, each one a fresh slice of humiliation. Serena fought to keep her breathing even, her thoughts swimming back to her grandmother's voice. Hold your head high, even when the world wants to push it down. At last, Julia handed back the pass, her fingers brushing Serena's a fraction too hard, an unspoken slap. Well, Julia said, her tone acidic, just make sure you stay out of the way of our other first-class guests. Serena's eyes locked onto Julia's, a quiet storm gathering behind them. I plan to sit right here, she replied, her voice low but echoing like thunder in a canyon. Julia's face stiffened, a flush of frustration rising to her cheeks. Without another word, she turned sharply and disappeared down the aisle, leaving Serena alone with the tension vibrating around her like a struck chord. Serena closed her eyes again, this time not to rest but to armor herself. She was no stranger to battles. She had fought them on conference stages, in hostile board meetings, in hushed halls where men whispered her name like a threat. But this was different. This was intimate, raw, a test of the dignity she had spent a lifetime forging. As the plane door shut and the engine's rumble deepened, Serena inhaled slowly, a silent promise to herself blooming in her chest. She would not be moved. Not today, not ever. Captain Richard Moore stepped out of the cockpit with a practiced authority that had once commanded respect in every corner of the sky. His eyes, sharp and cold, scanned the cabin as if he were inspecting a line of soldiers. Julia hurried to him, her voice lowered but urgent. She's refusing to move. I've asked politely, but she's causing a disturbance. Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't glance at Serena yet, he didn't need to. His mind had already decided who she was and what she deserved. Serena watched him approach, her heartbeat steady, though her hands pressed tightly against her knees beneath the blanket. Ma'am, Richard began, his voice as firm and heavy as the steel under the plane. You're disturbing my crew and the other passengers. I need you to move to the correct cabin or leave this aircraft immediately. Serena looked up, her eyes too dark, unwavering stars against the cabin lights. I am exactly where I'm supposed to be, she said, her voice calm but vibrating with a hidden blade. Richard ignored her words, turning instead to Julia as though Serena had spoken in a language he refused to understand. Get her out, he ordered sharply. Serena inhaled, her chest expanding as if gathering every quiet scream she had swallowed her whole life. She stood, her posture tall and regal despite the pressure that threatened to break her from the inside out. I paid for this seat. I will not be moved because of your ignorance, she declared, her tone slicing through the air like a lightning strike. A flicker of surprise flashed across Richard's face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold fury that pulsed just beneath his skin. Don't you dare speak to me that way, he snapped. Then, without warning, his hand came down, a sharp crack that seemed to split the world in two. Serena's head snapped sideways, her cheek burning under the violent sting. The sound echoed through the cabin, leaving a silence so deep it felt alive. Passengers froze mid-breath, some gasping, others turning away, their faces pale with horror. In that instant, time collapsed into a single, infinite moment. The moment when Serena Carter, billionaire and warrior, was struck like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. Her hand rose slowly to her cheek, her fingers trembling against the heat blossoming across her skin. But her eyes burned brighter than any flame Richard had ever seen. A slow, deep breath filled her lungs. She turned her face back toward him, every inch of her radiating an unspoken promise. You will regret this, she whispered, her words so soft they seemed to float, yet so heavy they landed like stones in his gut. Richard staggered back a step but quickly straightened, his pride clawing at his throat. "Escort her off this plane," he barked. Serena didn't flinch. She bent down, picked up her small handbag, and stood with a grace so sharp it cut through the thick air. She turned, eyes sweeping over the silent, stunned passengers. Some looked away in shame. Others simply watched, paralyzed by their own helplessness. With each step down the aisle, Serena carried not just her own pain, but the centuries of voices silenced before her. Her heels struck the floor softly, but echoed like war drums in the minds of everyone watching. At the exit, she paused, turning one last time to face Richard and Julia. "You think you've won?" she said, her voice now steady and echoing like a vow in a cathedral. "But this is only the beginning." Then she stepped off the plane, leaving behind a silence so heavy it threatened to crush the cabin. Outside, the night air wrapped around her like a cloak. And though her cheek still burned, it was nothing compared to the fire now raging in her chest. Serena Carter walked into the darkness, but inside, a light brighter than any runway lamp had already been lit. In the quiet glow of the VIP lounge, Serena Carter sat with her fingers interlaced, her cheek still tender beneath the soft, diffused lights. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee, but none of it reached her. Her thoughts buzzed like a swarm of hornets under her skin. She stared at her phone, her reflection caught in the black screen. A billionaire, a leader, a woman who had clawed her way through every closed door, every whispered insult. Yet tonight, she had been reduced to nothing more than an unwanted presence, as if her entire life's worth could be dismissed with a single slap. She exhaled, slow and deep, the sound low and heavy in her chest. Then her thumb moved, unlocking her phone. One by one, she dialed numbers so familiar they felt like scars on her memory. "Jessica," she said when the line picked up. "Activate the crisis protocol. I need a full internal investigation on Flight 417, every detail, every complaint record, every past incident involving Julia Bennett and Captain Richard Moore. I want it all on my desk before sunrise." Jessica's voice wavered on the other end. "Yes, Ms. Carter, understood." Next, Serena called Marcus, her operations director. "Marcus," she said, her tone calm but edged like ice, "I want you to prepare a full audit of our training programs. We will rebuild this airline's culture from the inside out, quietly, effectively, without mercy for those who think power means permission to humiliate." There was a pause. Marcus knew her well enough not to argue. "Right away," he replied. Serena's fingers tapped the edge of her phone as she looked out into the dark tarmac beyond the lounge glass. Her reflection merged with the blinking runway lights, creating the illusion of a woman surrounded by 1,000 stars. Her mind flashed back to her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of corn bread and honey drifting through the air, her grandmother's voice rising above the evening radio. "Baby, your worth is not given, it's declared, every single day." Serena pressed her lips together, her breath catching. Tonight, she had been forced to declare her worth in front of strangers who would rather pretend they saw nothing. But she was no longer that girl in the cramped kitchen. She was the owner of the very sky they tried to deny her. Her phone buzzed again. Jessica had already sent initial reports. Serena scanned them quickly, patterns of microaggressions, overlooked complaints, culture of silent complicity. Her jaw tightened. Serena rose, her gray coat falling around her like a soft battle flag. She gathered her bag and walked across the lounge, each step steady and deliberate, as if echoing a silent war drum. A young employee at the desk looked up, eyes wide. "Ms. Carter, do you need anything?" he stammered. She paused, turned her head slightly, and offered a small, razor-sharp smile. "Yes," she said. "I need every person in this company to remember tonight, to remember that silence is complicity, and complicity will be eradicated." The young man swallowed hard and nodded. Serena continued walking, her mind already weaving the threads of a new strategy. Not just punishment, transformation. Not just for Julia and Richard, but for every unspoken prejudice stitched into the seams of her airline. She reached the private elevator, pressed the button, and watched the floor numbers blink. Her reflection stared back at her, calm but electric with quiet fury. As the doors slid open, she stepped in and whispered to herself, almost like a prayer. "This ends now." In that moment, the hum of the lounge, the chatter of passengers, the distant roar of engines, all of it faded. There was only Serena and the vow echoing in her bones. Tonight, a storm had been born, and she would be its relentless eye. Morning light cut across the glass walls of Serena's headquarters, painting long golden stripes on the polished marble floors. The building hummed with an uneasy energy, as if every corridor could feel the coming quake. Serena stood at the end of the executive conference room, her hands pressed flat against the table. Around her sat her core leadership team, Jessica with her restless pen, Marcus flipping through documents, and a few department heads shifting nervously in their seats. Jessica cleared her throat, breaking the silence that weighed like a stone on everyone's shoulders. "We have compiled initial reports," she began, her voice tight. "There are at least 27 documented complaints involving Julia and Richard over the past 5 years. Most were marked resolved without proper follow-up." Serena didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the window beyond, where the skyline rose like a silent jury. Marcus spoke next, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "We also found consistent patterns of subtle discrimination in our training logs. Microaggressions, biased promotion reviews, disciplinary inconsistencies. It's systemic." Serena inhaled slowly, her breath deep and quiet like the moment before a wave crashes. "Burn it all down," she said finally, her voice low, precise. "Every outdated policy. Every shield of silence. We rebuild from the ground up." The room fell completely still. No one dared to argue. They knew this wasn't a suggestion. It was a verdict. Outside, a seagull glided past the window, its wings cutting through the morning air with a freedom Serena had not yet allowed herself to feel. Jessica leaned forward cautiously. "We'll need to start with new training modules, deep cultural sensitivity, anti-discrimination, emotional intelligence workshops. It's a massive undertaking." Serena turned her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto Jessica. "We are not here to simply repair a broken wing," she said, each word deliberate, heavy. "We are here to design a new way to fly." A flicker of something, pride or fear, moved across Jessica's face. She nodded. Serena's fingers drummed against the table, a quiet rhythm that echoed the pulse building in her chest. "I want immediate audits of all flight crew behavior," Serena continued. "Anonymous surveys. Passenger feedback channels restructured to ensure every voice is heard and investigated. No more silencing." Marcus shifted in his seat, glancing at the others before speaking. "There will be resistance," he warned. "Some senior staff will push back hard. They'll claim this damages morale, that we're overcorrecting." Serena's jaw tightened. "Let them push," she said, her voice cold as steel. "They will either evolve or they will leave. We're not here to comfort the guilty." A heavy silence thickened in the room, but under it a subtle vibration began, like the first tremor before an earthquake. Jessica finally set her pen down and leaned back, her shoulders dropping as if she had been holding a breath for years. "When do we start?" she asked. Serena's lips curved, a fierce, unwavering line. "We started the moment Richard raised his hand against me," she replied. "Now we finish what he started." Through the window, the first rays of the sun rose higher, splintering into sharp lines of light across the table. Each beam seemed to mark the beginning of a new chapter, a silent drumbeat echoing Serena's vow. She straightened, gathering the reports into a single stack, and looked around the table one last time. "No more shadows," she said quietly. "No more hiding." Then she turned, her coat sweeping behind her like the wing of a falcon, and stepped into the hallway beyond. A hallway that had never felt so alive with possibility, or so ready for war. Julia Bennett sat alone in the dimly lit break room, her uniform jacket draped over the back of her chair like a forgotten promise. The faint buzz of the vending machine was the only sound, a quiet companion to her restless thoughts. She stared down at the untouched coffee in her hands, the steam curling into the air and vanishing before her eyes. Her mind replayed Serena's unwavering gaze, the quiet power that had shattered Julia's practiced composure. At first, Julia told herself she had only been doing her job, maintaining order, protecting standards, following procedure. But the more she repeated those words, the more they sounded like hollow echoes in a dark, empty hall. In the training room 2 floors below, the first mandatory cultural awareness session had begun. Julia had skipped it that morning, claiming a headache, but she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. Her phone vibrated on the table, a new message from the HR department. "You are required to attend today's session. Attendance is non-negotiable." Julia's fingers trembled as she set the phone down, her reflection in the screen showing a face she no longer recognized. She remembered the young girl she had been, full of warmth, eager to help people feel safe in the sky. When had that warmth curdled into suspicion? When had she started seeing passengers as threats instead of humans? A sudden movement in the hallway caught her eye. Richard Moore stood just outside the door, his posture rigid, arms crossed. His face was carved into a permanent scowl, the lines around his mouth deepened by years of command and unchecked pride. He stepped inside, his shoes clicking sharply against the tile. "They're forcing me into those ridiculous sessions, too," he growled, his voice low and harsh. "A waste of time. You know what we did was right. We kept order." Julia's eyes flickered, a mix of resentment and uncertainty flashing across her features. "Did we?" she whispered, almost too softly for Richard to hear. His head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "Start doubting now," he snapped. "That's how they win. We've earned our positions. We don't bow to passengers, no matter who they think they are." But Julia didn't answer. Her gaze had drifted past Richard, toward the empty hallway beyond. In her mind, she saw Serena again, standing tall even as her cheek turned red under Richard's hand. That image gnawed at something deep inside her, a place she hadn't visited in years. Richard slammed his fist against the table, the sound slicing through the heavy silence. "You're with me on this," he demanded, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Julia flinched, the coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her cup. Her eyes rose slowly to meet his, and for the first time she saw him not as a mentor or protector, but as a man terrified of losing the walls he had built around himself. I don't know," she said, her voice breaking like thin ice. Richard's face contorted, a storm of betrayal flashing through his eyes. He turned sharply and stomped out, his shadow lingering in the room long after he was gone. Julia stared at the doorway, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She placed her cup down and stood, her legs weak but moving. In that moment, she realized the ache inside her wasn't fear of losing her job. It was the fear of confronting who she had become. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed around her, she caught a glimpse of her reflection one last time. The woman staring back was not the confident attendant she had believed herself to be. She was someone at war with her own silence. When the elevator chimed open on the training floor, Julia took a trembling breath and stepped out. For the first time in years, she was ready to listen. Not to defend, not to justify, but to truly listen. Down the hallway, the door to the training room stood open, bright light spilling into the corridor like a promise. Julia's steps echoed softly as she moved forward, each one carrying the fragile weight of a heart beginning to crack open. The training room smelled of stale coffee and nervous energy. Rows of chairs formed a loose circle, their gray cushions marked by restless hands and shifting bodies. A projector flickered against the far wall, casting pale light across uncertain faces. Julia sat near the back, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself smaller. Beside her, a young flight attendant named Claire spoke softly about a time she had misjudged a passenger, her voice trembling but sincere. Julia's hands twisted in her lap, each confession around her landing like quiet blows to the chest. The facilitator, a calm woman with a gentle authority, nodded as she guided them through stories of harm and the slow work of repair. Richard sat 2 seats away, arms folded tight, his jaw clenched so hard a small muscle jumped beneath his ear. His eyes darted from speaker to speaker, every testimony a mirror he refused to look into. Halfway through the session, the facilitator dimmed the lights and played a video. It showed reenactments of real passenger complaints. Subtle humiliations, cold stares, forced explanations for belonging in spaces they had every right to occupy. Julia felt her breath catch. On screen, a black woman in a simple gray coat stood quietly while a flight attendant demanded her ticket again and again. Her eyes glimmered with something beyond pain, a deep, bottomless exhaustion. Julia pressed her palm to her chest, as though trying to keep her heart from spilling out onto the floor. The video ended and the room fell into a hushed tremor. The facilitator spoke into the silence, her voice low and even. Who here saw themselves in that scene? For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Then Julia raised her hand, slowly, hesitantly, as if lifting 1,000 invisible stones. The facilitator's eyes softened. "Thank you," she said. Julia swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. "I thought I was protecting order," she said, her voice cracking in places. "But I was protecting my own fear, my own ignorance." A sharp sound broke the moment. Richard stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. "This is absurd," he spat. "We're being forced to grovel because someone decided to be offended." Julia turned to him, her eyes shining with a new, raw light. "No," she said quietly, but the word rang through the room like a bell. "We're being asked to see people as human, and we failed." Richard's face twisted, but something flickered beneath his anger, a tremor, a crack. He stood frozen, his mouth open but empty of words. Julia turned back to the group. "I don't want to be that person anymore," she whispered. "I don't want to keep hurting people to feel strong." Her words seemed to ripple outward, sinking into the walls, the floor, the trembling hearts around her. Richard lowered his head, his fists unclenching as though they had finally lost the will to fight. For the first time, he looked smaller, mortal. Silence wrapped the room again, but this time it felt different. Not an emptiness, but a space where something new could grow. Julia closed her eyes, her tears spilling freely now. A warm hand landed gently on her shoulder. She looked up to see Claire nodding, her own eyes wet. In that moment, Julia felt the fragile beginning of a different kind of strength. Not the brittle armor she had worn for so long, but something living and real, forged from humility and the courage to change. Across the room, Richard finally sank back into his chair, his eyes distant, his breathing shallow. A single thought echoed through his mind like a pulse. What have I become? He didn't know yet, but for the first time, he wanted to find out. Serena stood in her private office. The city skyline sprawled beyond the glass behind her. Morning light spilled across her desk, highlighting the neat stacks of reports and handwritten notes scattered like quiet battle plans. Her phone buzzed once, a short, sharp sound that pierced the silence. Jessica's voice came through, calm but urgent. "They're here, Julia and Richard." Serena closed her eyes, feeling her breath move slowly through her chest like a tide. She turned, her heels whispering against the floor, and stepped into the conference room. Julia sat rigid at one end of the long table, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles blanched. Richard sat beside her, his broad shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on a point just beyond the polished wood. Serena paused at the doorway. The room seemed to contract around her presence. She walked forward, each step measured, deliberate. Julia rose quickly, her voice trembling even before she spoke. "MS, Carter, Serena, her words shattered like glass. Tears sprang to her eyes, her breath stuttering in her chest. Serena said nothing, letting the silence wrap around them like a heavy cloak. Julia pressed her palms to her chest. "I was wrong," she finally forced out, her voice raw and thin. "I saw you as a threat instead of a person. I let my fear speak louder than my humanity. And I am so deeply sorry." Her words echoed, leaving a soft ache in the air. Serena's gaze stayed fixed on Julia, her face unreadable, her breath slow and deep. Richard shifted beside Julia, his fingers twitching on the table. I never meant," he started, his voice gravelly, each word a struggle. "I thought I was protecting order, protecting the crew. But I see now I was protecting myself, my pride, my ignorance." His voice faltered, and he dropped his head into his hands. The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a vast, black ocean. Serena walked to the far end of the table, resting her hands on the cool surface. "You both hurt me," she said, her voice low but clear, a blade sheathed in velvet. "Not just with your actions, but with the message you sent to every person watching, that someone like me did not belong." Julia let out a quiet sob, her shoulders shaking. Serena's gaze softened only slightly. "I don't want your fear," she continued. "I don't want your shame. I want your change, real, painful, uncomfortable change." Richard lifted his head, his eyes red and hollow. "I don't know if I can be that man," he whispered. Serena leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his, unblinking. "Then decide," she replied, her words striking like thunder. "Decide if you will remain the echo of an old, dying world or become part of something that actually deserves to fly." Richard's breath hitched. He looked at Julia, her tear-streaked face reflecting the same question. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Julia stepped forward, her hand outstretched as though offering the last fragile piece of herself. Richard followed, hesitating only once before placing his hand beside hers. Serena regarded them, her eyes shimmering with an emotion that hovered between rage and mercy. "I will accept your apologies," she said slowly, each syllable carved from stone. "But understand, forgiveness is not the end. It is only the invitation to begin again." Julia's tears fell freely now, her chest rising and falling with deep, trembling breaths. Richard nodded, a slight, almost broken motion, but it was enough. Serena straightened, stepping back from the table, her arms folding gently over her chest. "Leave this room," she commanded softly. "Not as who you were, but as who you choose to become next." Julia turned, her steps unsteady, but each one carried a new, uncertain determination. Richard followed, his face pale, his eyes distant, a man walking out of a storm, unsure if he'd ever truly dry. As the door closed behind them, Serena stood alone in the echo of their apologies. She let out a long, quiet breath, the weight in her chest shifting, not vanishing, but becoming something she could carry. Outside the window, a single bird cut across the morning sky, its wings catching the first light like a silent promise. The large training auditorium buzzed with cautious curiosity. Employees from every corner of the airline, flight attendants, pilots, ground staff, managers filed in, their voices low, their eyes darting from one another to the stage at the front. Banners hung along the walls. "Respect, dignity, flight begins with humanity." Serena stood off to the side, watching as the seats filled. Her hands were folded lightly in front of her, her gaze calm but alert, catching every whisper, every nervous shuffle. On stage, Julia adjusted the microphone stand, her fingers trembling slightly. She glanced toward Richard, who stood just behind her, his hands clasped tightly at his back. Both wore simple, dark uniforms, no badges, no rank distinctions. Today, they were simply human. Julia took a breath, her chest rising as if she were about to step off a cliff. "I know many of you recognize me," she began, her voice small but clear. "And I know many of you have heard what I did, who I was." A hush spread across the room, like a collective breath waiting to be exhaled. "I used to believe that my job was to maintain control," she continued. "To keep order, even if it meant stepping over someone else's dignity. I thought following the rules was enough, but I was wrong." She paused, her eyes moving across the crowd, stopping briefly whenever she saw another tearful or stunned face. "It took seeing someone stand up to me, someone who refused to shrink, to realize the damage I caused," Julia said, her voice beginning to shake. "And I don't expect forgiveness from all of you, but I am here to change." A low murmur rippled through the audience. Julia swallowed hard, then stepped aside. Richard moved forward, his expression tight, every movement deliberate as though he were holding back a storm. "I thought strength meant never admitting weakness," he started, his voice deeper and slower. "I thought discipline meant shutting out anything that threatened my sense of control." He paused, looking down at the stage floor. "But I saw what that belief really created: fear, silence, harm, and for that I am deeply sorry." The words seemed to drain the last of his defiance. When he looked up again, his eyes glistened with the rawness of a man stripped to the bone. "This is not just about me," he said. "It's about all of us. We've let prejudice hide in our corridors, in our lounges, in our own hearts. We need to become more than just a company that flies planes. We need to be a company that lifts people." Silence engulfed the auditorium for a long, trembling moment. Then a single clap. Another. And slowly, the sound grew, rolling through the room like a rising tide. Serena stepped onto the stage. The applause softened, shifting into a deep, reverent quiet. She stood between Julia and Richard, her presence filling every corner of the room. "We are not here to shame," she said, her voice firm but warm, like distant thunder promising rain. "We are here to transform, to look at each other and see beyond uniforms and titles, to remember that every passenger, every colleague carries a story we cannot see." She paused, letting the words hang like lanterns in the air. "This isn't a campaign," she continued. "It's a covenant, a promise that every flight, every greeting, every moment in our halls is an opportunity to choose respect over power, humanity over habit." She turned toward Julia and Richard, then back to the audience. "These two stood before you today, not because they are perfect now, but because they chose to confront their worst selves. That is where change begins." Julia lowered her head, her shoulders shaking in silent sobs. Richard closed his eyes, exhaling as if releasing decades of silent weight. Serena looked out across the sea of faces, each one holding a flicker of fear, hope, or shame. "We start today," she said, her voice breaking slightly before strengthening again. "And tomorrow, and every day after, this is how we build a sky worth flying under." A hush followed, deep and almost sacred. Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, the entire room rose in quiet unison. Hands met in tentative claps, then stronger, until the auditorium thundered with applause. Julia and Richard turned toward Serena, their faces wet, their eyes searching for something solid. She nodded once, and in that simple gesture, gave them permission to step into the light of their own rebuilding. Above them, the new banner fluttered lightly, as though catching the first breath of a long-awaited wind. The grand summit hall shimmered with warm golden light, its high ceilings echoing the low hum of hundreds of gathered voices. Long rows of chairs stretched toward a central stage, where a single podium stood waiting, draped in deep navy cloth bearing the airline's new emblem. A pair of open wings, intertwined. Serena walked slowly down the center aisle, her steps unhurried, every head turning as if pulled by a silent magnet. Her dark suit cut a sharp line against the pale carpet, her presence at once soft and immovable. She reached the front row and paused, turning to take in the audience. Employees, executives, ground crew, even loyal passengers invited to witness the culmination of months of transformation. Their eyes glistened with anticipation, uncertainty, and quiet wonder. Julia stepped onto the stage first, her hair pulled back in a simple knot, her hands clasped together at her waist. She stood behind the microphone, breathing slowly. "When I first put on this uniform," Julia began, her voice trembling but clear, "I thought it was my shield. I thought it made me someone important, someone untouchable." She swallowed hard, her eyes scanning the room. "But I used it to hide, to separate myself from the very people I promised to serve. I thought strength was in control. I know now that real strength lives in humility, in seeing another person's pain and not looking away." A murmur moved through the audience, as though a collective exhale had passed from seat to seat. Julia took a deep breath, her chin lifting. "I cannot change what I did, but I can choose what I become next. And I promise you, every day I will choose to see, to listen, and to grow." Applause rose, hesitant at first, then swelling into a wave. Julia stepped back, her face wet with tears, her hands trembling as she pressed them over her heart. Richard followed, his steps heavy, his gaze low. He stood behind the microphone, gripping the edges as though afraid it might drift away. "I have spent decades in these skies," he began, his voice rough, almost breaking. "I thought I understood leadership. I thought firmness meant safety. I thought silence from others meant agreement." He paused, his breath shaky. "I was wrong. Silence isn't agreement. Silence is pain. Silence is the echo of all the voices I refused to hear." He looked up then, eyes raw and open. "I failed not just Serena. I failed every passenger who trusted me, every colleague who looked to me for guidance, and I failed myself." A single tear traced the line of his cheek. He did not wipe it away. "But today, I stand here to begin again. I stand here to tell you I will spend the rest of my life earning the honor to lead, not by fear, but by respect." The hall fell into stillness. Then, slowly, the first clap came. It spread, gathering strength until the hall roared with applause, a sound like rain finally breaking after a long drought. Serena stepped onto the stage last. She looked at Julia and Richard, then at the sea of faces beyond them. "When I was a child," she began softly, "my grandmother told me that the sky belonged to everyone, that its vastness was a promise, that we all have room to rise." She paused, her eyes shining under the bright lights. "But somewhere along the way, we built invisible walls in that sky. We decided who belonged and who did not. We let fear become our compass instead of our shared humanity." She inhaled deeply, her shoulders rising, her voice gathering power. "Today, we tear down those walls. Today, we choose courage over comfort, not just because it is right, but because it is the only way forward." The audience rose to their feet as one, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor merging with the swell of applause. Serena turned slightly, meeting Julia's gaze, then Richard's. She nodded, a silent signal of absolution and expectation. She stepped forward, placing her hand on the podium, leaning in. "Let us be the kind of company that does not just fly above the clouds, but lifts every soul who dares to dream of the sky." A final wave of applause crashed over the stage, rolling like thunder across a summer field. As Serena stepped back, she looked up, as if seeing beyond the roof of the hall into the endless blue. A small, knowing smile curved across her lips, a silent vow written in the language of stars and open skies. Dawn broke over the city like a slow, golden tide, slipping through glass towers and glinting off silver wings parked along the runways. Serena stood in the observation deck of the headquarters, her reflection a soft silhouette against the vast morning sky. Below her, planes moved with gentle precision, each one a promise stitched into the fabric of a new day. She watched as a crew gathered near one aircraft, greeting passengers with open, unguarded smiles. Julia stood at the gate, her voice warm and steady as she welcomed a family with young children. Gone was the rigid posture, the watchful suspicion. In its place bloomed a quiet, humble pride. A few gates down, Richard adjusted the collar of a young pilot's uniform, offering a small nod and a firm pat on the shoulder. His face was lined but open, his eyes softer than they had ever been. Serena's gaze drifted across the tarmac, catching glimpses of small moments. An attendant bending down to help an elderly man with his bag, a pilot pausing to listen to a nervous passenger's story, a mechanic wiping grease from his hands to shake a child's small, eager palm. Each act, small as a heartbeat, carried the weight of something larger. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, but she didn't move to answer it. Instead, she pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the cool surface ground her as the warmth of the sunrise reached her skin. She remembered the sting on her cheek, the echo of that slap that had become more than pain. It had become ignition. The first crack in the old armor of silence, the spark that set an entire system alight with change. Serena closed her eyes, drawing in a slow breath, as though inhaling every story unfolding beneath her. In that quiet, she felt the pulse of something she had long fought to believe in, not just reform, but rebirth. When she opened her eyes again, her reflection no longer looked alone in it. She saw Julia's new grace, Richard's humbled strength, the crew's awakened warmth, 1,000 silent witnesses to the vow they had all made. She turned and walked toward the elevator, each step light, carrying her forward as though she were floating above old scars. As the doors slid open, a young staff member waited inside, his hands fidgeting nervously. He looked up at her, his eyes wide, his lips parting as though he might speak. Serena smiled, small and steady, and simply nodded. The young man's shoulders eased, a tiny breath escaping his lips like a prayer finally spoken. They rode down together in silence, but it was not the cold, brittle silence of before. This was a gentle hush, heavy with possibility. When the elevator doors opened to the bustling lobby below, Serena stepped out, her gaze sweeping across the room. Employees looked up, their eyes bright with recognition and something else, hope, shimmering and fragile but unmistakable. She paused, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. Then she whispered under her breath, a soft promise to no one and everyone all at once. The sky is only the beginning. She moved forward, the morning light catching in her hair, turning each step into a quiet declaration. Behind her, the echoes of footsteps multiplied, a chorus of new beginnings rising to meet the day. Outside, a jet lifted from the runway, its wings slicing into the pale sky, climbing higher and higher, as if it too knew there were no more limits, only wide-open blue waiting to be claimed.